Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. Welcome to the next video in my series of reading lists devoted to traditionalist authors. Today I'm going to be talking about A.K. Coomaraswamy. A lot of people pronounce his name incorrectly in America, in the Anglophone world, as Coomaraswamy. That's probably due to the peculiarity of the spelling. In any case, the AK stands for Anand or Ananda Kentish. Ananda Kentish Muthu Coomaraswamy. He was born on the 22nd of August in Colombia, in what was then Ceylon, occupied by the British. It is today known as the country of Sri Lanka. He died on the 9th of September 1947 in Needham, Massachusetts. He is known, I think, somewhat simplistically to most people who are not involved in reading traditionalist writings as perhaps merely an historian of Asian or even art or sacred art in general. He's much more than that. Now, he was extremely prolific. There are a number of articles which he wrote, in the hundreds actually, and various collections of them exist. I do want to bring to your attention, before we get into his writings, a bibliography index, in fact, of all of his writings. This is not easy to get a hold of, but this is called the Ananda K. Coomaraswamy Bibliography / Index, edited by his son Rama P. Coomaraswamy. This is published by something called Prologos Books, and that's in the UK, someplace called Tweedmouth, Berwick upon Tweed, TD 152HE. So this is not easy to get, but this has a list of his writings, and they are numbered, and the total number here is 913 works. So he's extremely prolific. Obviously, we're not going to go through all of these, and many of these are just articles, scholarly papers in hard to access journals. So if you only want to read one book about Coomaraswamy, you can't go wrong with what's the anthology known as the Essential Coomaraswamy, the Essential Ananda K. Coomaraswamy, edited again by his son Rama P. Coomaraswamy, with a foreword by Arvind Sharma. This is published by World Wisdom Books, easily obtainable online through Amazon or directly through their website. Let's just read from the blurb. I mean, there's some very interesting remarks here. So, for example, Sayyid Hussein Nasr, on the back of the book, he offers the first blurb, says, over 50 years have passed since the death of Ananda Coomaraswamy. It's considerably more than that by now, since when this came out. Yet, he says, he continues, his writings remain as pertinent today as when he wrote them, and his voice echoes in the ears of present-day seekers of truth and lovers of traditional art as it did a generation ago. In contrast to most scholarly works which became outmoded in current philosophical opuses, which became stale, Coomaraswamy's works possess a timelessness which flows from their being rooted in the eternal present. There's another interesting statement here by someone named Harry Oldmeadow, a scholar of traditionalist writings. I think he's Australian. He says, Ananda Coomaraswamy is best known as one of the 20th century's most erudite and precipient scholars of the sacred arts and crafts of both East and West. He also had few peers in the exegesis of traditional philosophy and metaphysics. That is an understatement. He most certainly was very learned in these subjects. And he goes on about this anthology. So this is extremely accessible, easy to obtain, considering the fact that many of Coomaraswamy's articles are not easily obtainable anymore. There was a marvelous trilogy, a 3-volume work devoted to Coomaraswamy's life and thought or teachings, and unfortunately it is now out of print and it's very expensive. online, because I've never been able to find all 3 volumes for sale online, through like Abe Books and other used book websites. But this was the trilogy prepared by someone named Roger Lipsey. Now, Roger Lipsey has a website with his own name, rogerlipsey.net. That's Roger, ROGERLIPSEY.net. And he compiled this in 3 volumes. The first volume was called, Coomaraswamy, His Life and Works. Then there was Coomaraswamy, Metaphysics. That's the second volume. And then Coomaraswamy, Traditional Art and Symbolism. So the Metaphysics and Traditional Art and Symbolism are collections of his writings that were spread around in all sorts of journals. And Lipsey was actually given the task of going through Coomaraswamy's papers, and he was given access to all of these by Coomaraswamy's wife, who survived him. And he says something interesting here on his website. He gives a whole description of his collection. He says, I've sometimes said that to read Coomaraswamy's writings for a year would be a vastly worthwhile education. I still think this is true. And he started in the 60s, and then this trilogy was published in the Bollingen series by Princeton University Press in 1977. He also says this. This is taken from a lecture he gave on Coomaraswamy in Delhi in India in 2013. Coomaraswamy in his later years conferred dignity on those who instinctively approach religious art as an epiphany, a transforming experience that teaches and touches both mind and heart. So doing, he was not arguing for an abandonment of scholarship. On the contrary, he was enlarging and refining a dimension that had been marginalized, forgotten, even scorned in the legitimate effort to construct an art history and modes of art historiography on a solid foundation. It was a dimension that had no voice, none that was thorough and persuasive until he spoke. That dignity was his own, communicated through his writings as if they were a secondary but nonetheless powerful darshan. And here he uses a Sanskrit term meaning a kind of direct exhibiting of the truth, and the person who takes the darshan is viewing and absorbing the knowledge directly, so to speak. So indeed, Coomaraswamy was an expert on sacred art. But you can't really be an expert on sacred art and truly understand what sacred art is unless you also have a profound understanding of the metaphysical truths of the sacred tradition in question. And so Coomaraswamy not only had that, but he was also an extremely erudite. And those of you who are maybe familiar with his works are aware that he was meticulous in footnoting. And indeed, some of his footnotes end up being longer than the book in question, where they appear. Coomaraswamy also was a master of many languages, and oftentimes in his footnotes he quotes or cites sources in the original languages, such as Latin, for example. On another occasion it might be German. On another occasion it might be Sanskrit or Pali. And he doesn't translate. And in fact, also Greek. So his books are not easy to read. That's why perhaps the best choice is the essential Coomaraswamy. But there are some other collections. One of the nicest and one of the most accessible collections, of which I do not have a copy. I read it many long years ago obtaining it from a library. And in America, it was published in those days, in the 40s, I think 30s or 40s, as Am I My Brother's Keeper? In the rest of the Anglophone world, it was published, I think in the UK, as The Bugbear of Literacy. This is one of his great masterpieces in which he challenges the whole idea of literacy as in fact being within the doctrine of tradition with a capital T and the degeneration of humanity and human civilization in this Kali Yuga. He argues for the primacy and supremacy of the oral as opposed to written doctrine. And of course, in the realm of esotericism, of course, the truly esoteric and occult doctrines are never written down. They are only transmitted in person, orally. So that's a very interesting collection if you can get a hold of that. So some of his other anthologies. We'll just look at anthologies before we go to his actual books. One of these is The Dance of Shiva. The Dance of Shiva, Essays on Indian Art and Culture. This is a Dover publication, and the Dover books are usually quite inexpensive. So he has various essays, for example, Hindu View of Art, Buddhist Primitives, The Dance of Shiva, Intellectual Fraternity, etc. So it's quite a range, but this is a very nice, accessible collection. And then in terms of art, The Transformation of Nature in Art, Theories of Art in Indian, Chinese, and European Medieval Art, Iconography, Ideal Representation, Perspective, and Space Relations. This is a very profound work and is really worth reading very carefully. Again, this is a Dover publication. I, in fact, found this used for $5. So these books can easily be obtained on the used book market. Another very beautiful collection is by the Princeton University Press, entitled The Door in the Sky, Coomaraswamy on Myth and Meaning. This is, again, a collection put together by his son, Rama Coomaraswamy. Rama's name has come up quite a lot in this video. He's a scholar in his own right. Rama Coomaraswamy was a Catholic, and he has his own book on what is entitled The Destruction of the Christian Tradition. He was a traditionalist Catholic, so he was against Vatican II. He kept the Latin Mass. Later, in fact, he became a Catholic priest. He was originally trained as a physician, as a surgeon, and then for a medical reason, he had to retrain as a psychologist or psychiatrist. So that's also a very nice collection. So now let's look at some of his books. In terms of art, by way of example, just because I happen to have this volume, it's very well illustrated. A lot of these books of his, especially on art, are easily available in India through Munshi Ram Manohar Lal publishers. But if you buy them online, I would advise against ordering from booksellers in India. You just never know who you're dealing with, and you could give them your credit card number and then get into a lot of trouble. So if you're going to order them, get them used online, and make sure that the bookseller is in the U.S. or at least in Europe or UK, wherever you might live. So I'm going to now talk about his three most important books, in my opinion. So, of course, this reflects my own interests, but these are also probably among his most challenging works. This is an extremely penetrating study of the question of time and eternity, and it also touches on the question, in some sense as well, about the notion of the universe being originated in time or not. This is a very profound study. Time and eternity. He looks at, after a brief introduction of some 7 or 8 pages, he looks in order at the doctrines about time and eternity in Hinduism, then in Buddhism, then in ancient Greece, then in Islamic civilization, and then he concludes with the Christian civilization, Christian tradition, and modern times. This book is not as heavily footnoted, I think, as some of his other works. Nevertheless, it is a challenging read. If you want to read Coomaraswamy, you must read slowly and carefully, and then stop and then digest what you have read before moving on. This book, Hinduism and Buddhism, is, I think, probably the most profound presentation of the integral doctrines of these traditions available in the English language. And this book also is not as heavily footnoted. I mean, there are notes, but they're in the form of endnotes, but they're not as formidable, I would say, as you find in his other works. And probably the most heavily footnoted book of his, it's extremely challenging to read, is Spiritual Authority and Temporal Power in the Indian Theory of Government. This is an extremely profound work that touches on many issues of sacred kingship, I would say, and the relationship between the sacerdotium and the regnum, or that is to say, between the spiritual authority and the monarch, the political authority, so to speak, in tradition with a capital T. There are a lot of notes in this, a lot of citations from classical Indian sources, especially the Vedas, but many others as well. And even though it's only about 87 pages, I think the footnotes truly, in this case, overwhelm the text. So here's an example, page 26 and 27. On 26 and 27, you just have 2 lines of text, and the rest of the page is just footnotes. Did you get that? Yeah. So it's a really interesting, but very challenging, but worth the effort to read. I'm going to conclude this video now with the last book of Coomaraswamy to appear. And I think this is of great interest. This appeared after his death. He was working on this text, but it didn't appear until many, many years after his demise. And this is called Guardians of the Sun Door, Late Iconographic Essays and Drawings of Ananda K. Coomaraswamy, including Philo's Doctrine of the Cherubim, the Greek Sphinx, Ether in Greek, and Indian Cosmology. This, too, is a very challenging work, but it's, I think, one of his most interesting. It was published in 2004 by Fons Vitae, and I happen to know, I spoke with the publisher, that they took upon themselves considerable expense and effort in bringing out this book, thanks to the efforts of the editor one, Robert A. Strom, who put in a great deal of work to bring this scholarly contribution of Coomaraswamy to the reading public. This is probably my favorite book of Coomaraswamy. So I will conclude there, and once again, if you are able to get a copy of the Trilogy by Roger Lipsey, even if you access it through a good library, it's really worth your time to read that book, and especially the biographical volume is extremely interesting. So I'll leave you with that. I hope you all find this I hope you find this useful. He's a very challenging author, and we don't really hear much about him, which is another reason I wanted to make this video, and hope that people will be encouraged to take the initiative to go and explore his writings. Thank you so much for watching.